Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be doing a walkthrough of CSS Grid Garden. So for level 1 we want to move the water such that it's in the same grid box as the carrots. So we can use GridColumnStart 3, and that will water the area starting at the third vertical grid line. So we can conceptualize this as 1, 2, 3, so that's the third vertical grid line, and we start here. And since we don't define an end, it'll just encompass one of these boxes. So now we want to move this poison to the weeds, which are in the 5th box. We're going to use GridColumnStart to move this. So GridColumnStart 5. And again, we can conceptualize this as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It starts at the 5th vertical line, and since we don't define an end, it'll only span until the next vertical line. So now we're going to move the water so that it encompasses all of these carrots, and we're going to extend the water across multiple columns by adding the GridColumnEnd property. So GridColumnEnd, and we want it to end on the 4th vertical line. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and at this point we want it to end. So now we're going to water all of these carrots, but they want us to use the GridColumnEnd property with a value that's less than 5. So the water starts at GridColumn 5, it starts here, and now we want to have it go up to this line, so 1, 2, so we'll do GridColumnEnd at 2. So now we're going to count the grid columns from the right by using negative numbers. So we started at 1, and we're going to give GridColumnEnd a negative value, so -1, -2. So we just counted these vertical lines backwards, and that's how we knew to end at -2. So now we're going to use the GridColumnStart property, but we're going to use negative values for it. So when we use negative values, we're indicating that we're counting from the right to the left. This is -1, this is -2, and this is -3. So we want to start here at -3. So we're going to write GridColumnStart -3. So now we're going to use the span keyword in order to water both of these carrots. So we already know that the grid column starts at 2, and then we want it to span for 2 from there. So GridColumnEnd span 2. So our grid column starts here at 2, and then we say that we want it to span for 2 more after that, so 1, 2. So now we're going to use the GridColumnEnd property with the span keyword to water all of the carrots. So we already know that the grid column starts at 1, and now we want it to span for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns after that. So GridColumnEnd span 5. So now we're going to use the span keyword with the GridColumnStart property to set the width relative to the end position. So we know that the end position is here at 6, and then we're going to span for 1, 2, 3 from there. So GridColumnStart span 3. So now we're going to move the water so it waters the carrots. But instead of writing GridColumnStart and GridColumnEnd, we're going to use a shorthand, just GridColumn. So GridColumn, and we want our start to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then our end to be 6. So 4 will represent the start, and then we'll input 6 in this notation, which looks like a fraction. So now we're going to use that shorthand again. We're going to use GridColumn, but we want to also include the span keyword. So we're going to do GridColumn span 3, 5. So we're defining the end at the 5th column, and then we're saying that we want our start to span 3 relative from there. So this is 5, and then we do 1, 2, 3. So now we're going to use GridRow start to move the water to the location of the carrots. So GridRow starts, we know that the row is going to be the third one. Now we're going to use the shorthand property for grid rows. We're going to designate our start on the third, and then we're going to end it on the sixth. So we're going to set our grid row starts at 3 and our grid row ends at 6. So now we're going to move the poison to the weeds using both grid column and grid row. So we know that the grid column is the second one, so we're going to do 2. And we know the grid row is the last one, which is the 5th, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it spans from the 5th to the 6th horizontal border. So now we're going to use both grid column and grid row to span across the entire area of all of these carrots. So we want our grid column to start at 2 and we want it to end at 6. So grid column, we're going to do 2 over 6. And then for our grid row, we're going to do 1 to 6 because we want all of these rows. So now we're going to water all of the carrots, but we're going to use the shorthand of GridArea, which will accept 4 values separated by slashes. And the GridArea shorthand will represent the grid row start, the grid column start, the grid row end, and the grid column end. So GridArea, so we want the grid row to start at 1. We want the grid column to start at 2. And we want the grid row to end at 4 and the grid column to end at 6. So we have this water1 ID, which runs straight down the 4th column, but we want to define an additional area which will cover all of these unwatered carrots. So we're going to use GridArea. So we want the grid row to start at 2. We want the grid column to start at 3. We want the grid row to end at 5, and we want the grid column to end at 6. So for this level, we're going to move the poison from the second column to the last one, and we're going to do that by using the order property. And the order property specifies the order of the grid item. So right now the water class has an order of 0, and we can make the poison ID have an order of 1 so that it's positioned after the water. So now we have the water and poison alternating, but we want all of the poison to be on the first row. So we have the water class having an order of 0, but we want the poison to come before the water. So since the water is at 0, we have to give poison a negative order so that we can put it before the water. So we'll do -1. So now we're going to use grid template column with a percentage of 50. So we have 5 rows, but we're not necessarily going to have 5 columns anymore. We're just going to cut them off here. So let's do grid template columns 50%. So we were able to section off all of the carrots, but we still maintain the 5 template rows, which each take up 20%, and each one of our columns takes up 50%. So now we can use the repeat function as a way to simplify writing this sort of chain of 20%. So instead of typing the same value 5 times like it is here, we could just use the repeat function like this by doing repeat first parameter 5, 20%. We're going to use the repeat function and create 8 columns, each with width 12.5. So grid template columns repeats 8, 12.5%. So this level is telling us that we don't have to strictly use just pixels or EM or percentages. We can use a mixture. So we're going to create 3 columns with these values. So grid template columns, 100 pixels for the first one, 3 EM for the second one, and 40% for the last one. So this is 100 pixels, this is 3 EM, and then this one is 40% of the width. So in this level, we're going to learn about the fractional units, and we're going to use it to have the weeds make up 1/6 and the water make up 5/6 of the space. So grid templates columns. So the first one is going to take up 1 fractional unit, and the second one is going to take up 5 fractional units. So if we only did 1 fractional unit, then we see that our column took up the entire span. And if we 1 fractional unit and then 1 fractional unit, we allocated half of the space for the poison and half of the space for the water. And if we do 1 fractional unit and then 5 fractional units, we're able to cover the weeds with the poison and then the rest with the water. So for this level, we're going to create 5 columns. We want the first one to span 50 pixels, which will just cover these carrots. And then we want 3 to just make up dirt in the middle. And then we want the 5th one to just span another 50 pixels to cover the weeds. So we're going to do grid templates columns. So 50 pixels, which covers the carrots. 3 are just going to be 3 columns of dirt. So repeats 3 1 fractional units. And then at the end here, we're going to do another 50 pixels for the weeds. So for this level, we're going to create 3 columns. The first one is just going to span the weeds. The next one is going to span the carrots with water. And then the third one is going to span these weeds over here. So grid template columns. We already know that the weeds take up 75 pixels, so that'll be our first column. And then we're told that 3/5 of the remaining space is growing carrots and 2/5. So we know that we can allocate 3 fractional units of the remaining space for the carrots and 2 fractional units for the weeds. For this level, we're going to use the grid template rows property. So we're told that the water is only set to fill the 5th row, which means that we're going to have to create 4 small rows up here and then have the 5th row cover the whole area of all of these carrots. So grid templates rows. So we know that this is 50 pixels. If we divide that by 4, we have 12.5. So what we can do is repeat 4 12.5 pixels. We can allocate 1 fraction of the space for the remaining row, which will cover everything after the 50 pixels. So for this level, instead of writing grid template rows and grid template columns, we're going to use the grid template shorthand property. So the way that is represented is that all of our definitions for the grid template row comes before the slash, and all of our definitions for the grid template columns come after the slash. So grid templates. So for our grid template row, we want it to be 60%. That's how much these carrots take up. So we're going to do 60%. And then we'll do a slash and we'll define the grid template columns as 200 pixels because that is the width that these carrots take up, 200 pixels. So for this last level, we're going to have a 50 pixel path down here. So that's going to be 1 row. And then we'll have 2 columns, one of which is going to have a width of 20%, and that's going to encompass these weeds. And the remaining percentage is going to be allocated for all of these carrots. So we're going to use the grid template property, and we're going to define our rows as 1 fractional unit and 50 pixels. So that'll create 2 rows, 50 pixels for the bottom path. And then we're going to write a slash and then define our columns So the first column is going to be 20%, and the second one is going to take up one fractional unit, meaning everything remaining after that 20%. Alright, so that's everything. Thank you guys for watching.